Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Lynch, of course, and I am going to give you an abridged version of the Chapter 3 perception and pattern recognition. Clearly, it's with the video, so I want to keep this very short and sweet. It is just part of what I want to talk about pattern recognition, but I think that later on, when we're actually in class, we can bring it back into a discussion that is pertinent to a lot of other discussions that we'll be having. So So the first thing I think we need to talk about is the information processing model. And this is going to sort of be the backbone of the class because everything we'll be talking about will pretty much fit into this particular model. So the information processing theory is an approach to cognitive development that suggests a way in which humans process the information that they receive. This theory contrasts the behaviorist theory that humans simply respond to stimuli. We talked about that in class. This theory suggests that information is processed in stages, much like the way in which a computer processes data. Okay. So I want to actually go back to this. Okay, so in the 1960s or 70s, when PCs were starting to become more common in people's households and in offices, we also had the emergence of cognitive psychology. So we kind of looked at the information processing approach the same as with the brain. So even today we use the same terminology when we talk about aspects of our brain. So for example, the information enters the input devices. Okay, so that is like the sensory memory. So it enters, through the mouse and the jump drive that we have, and then, but that's like our senses, like the mouse and the keyboard. So then you can see the information is processed into a working memory, which is like the CPU or the processor. Then the information, after being processed in a working memory, it's stored and then recalled from specific areas of our long-term memory, which is kind of considered like our hard drive. So this recalled information can lead to an output response, which is a response to the stimuli, which is what we see on our computer monitor. So it's kind of the same type of system as we would consider our brains to be like. So our computer analogy is very similar to what we think of when we weren't sure about what our brain, the process of our brain. We're able to look at the computers and sort of make that. So just a little bit about the information processing model. I'm sure that you are familiar with this, but I just want to briefly talk about it. So what happens is, of course, you can see this, our sensory memory intakes the information through all our senses. So through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, obviously you know all of those. And it actually, there's about 11 million bytes of information that's coming in through our per second into our sensory memory. So what happens is that if we decide to pay attention to some of that, and it's usually something that's meaningful to us, then it will move into our short-term or working memory. And that's where we're going to place our information to get ready to process. Okay, so in order for information to be stored in our long-term memory, we have to do some things to it. This is not this is an active process. It's not it's not passive as behaviorist, the behaviorist paradigm, during the behaviorist paradigm. So in order for the information to be stored in long-term memory and then formally learned, what we consider to be learned, the information must be elaborated on through rehearsal over and over to consolidate the new data, and then we have to organize the information into existing knowledge, especially if it's similar to prior knowledge that we have, or we create a completely new schema or structure for that knowledge. And then, of course, once it's in long-term memory, then we can later recall the knowledge back into our short-term memory to compare the incoming information or help elaborate on our knowledge, or the experience that we just had or the knowledge that we just learned. Okay, so we'll talk more about, we talk about short-term memory, we'll talk more about the executive function and the attention, where that comes into play, but just sort of a really quick overview on the information processing model. So moving on. So we're just looking at the perception, sensory memory part of it, and the pattern recognition. The question is, what happens in our brains when we recognize a person, an object, a word, an item, etc.? We recognize something. Okay, there are two processes that we sort of subscribe to at the moment, and that is the bottom-up processing and the top-down processing. So the bottom-up processing is what we're going to focus on now. There's a few different theories for that, and then later on in other lectures, I'm going to talk about the top-down processing approach because it aligns a little bit more with some of the other theories we'll be discussing. So the bottom-up processing, so this essentially is saying that object recognition is influenced by parts of the stimulus, so pieces of the stimulus. So for example, I might have this, okay, if you guys can see it. And so you see some of the parts of it, okay, you can see it. Okay, there we go. And it looks like there's orange. It looks like there's, it's aluminum maybe because it's shiny. Maybe it looks like there's a blue pictures or blue lines on it. It looks a shape. So you're looking at little pieces, little shapes of the information of this object, but then you're building it up to create an object that you recognize. So it's bottom up. Data driven is another word for it. Okay, so if you don't recognize this, then you probably have never seen it before, okay? Or you might make a mistake and think it's something else, okay, that looks similar to that, but it's really not. So it's really not encoded very well. So we have the template theory, which states that we have multiple templates that are held in our long-term memory, and whenever we see an object, we take that object and we map it on exactly to that template. So if it doesn't match, then it's not, we don't recognize what it is. So this, this is a picture of a cat as a stimuli. Well, we might have a lot of templates for what animals look like or what cats look like. But in order for us to recognize it as a cat, we have to find, we have to search our memory for that exact cat. Okay, and if we don't, then we don't recognize it as what it is. Okay, so you can let that sink in a little bit. And so there's some problems with this theory. Obviously, I think we could talk quite a bit about that. But one of the weaknesses, of course, is that they're just imperfect matches, right? So we don't have enough room in our long-term memory to store all of those templates that we would need to recognize every single, for example, cat that we see. If we saw a picture of a cat or a cartoon of a cat, or sort of a cat with a, with maybe the cats that don't have fur. Okay, so we don't have that exact match in memory. We're not gonna know what that is, and so we're gonna have so many have to have so many templates in order to actually find and recognize that. So that's a problem. We don't have the capacity to have that many templates or store that many templates. And then another example of the problem of this theory is handwriting. So if you look at the box here, I think we can all agree that those are the letter A. But if you look at little pieces of that letter A, each A, they're different. So if the template theory is true, then if you look at those pieces, or sorry, if we don't have an A that matches one of these A's, then it's not in, we don't recognize it. But if you take into account all the different types of handwriting, that can be just scribbled really fast, or that's very, very neat, and as an instructor, I've seen all different kinds, that you eventually can read or at least get the gist of, that's thousands and thousands, if not millions, of different types of handwriting that we can still read. We understand what it is, we can put it into a word and have meaning, but it doesn't look like anything like, and what we would consider an actual A. And so there's something about maybe an overall typical A that we can match to maybe a prototype of an A, but let's hold that thought before we go into that particular thing. We also have these theories called recognition by components. So we're still looking at the little pieces and putting those together, and kind of like Lego building blocks, right? It's kind of actually called building blocks, or building something with Legos, where we're taking shapes and geometric pieces, and we're making them into recognizable objects. So it's called the geom theory. And so here's an example. So we have, on the left column, we have shapes that really don't have much meaning for us, and they're numbered here. This is a very simple example. And then on the right column, you see that, oh, okay, so there's items that we do recognize. So what happens is that we're taking these shapes, these geometric shapes, and we're matching them together, building them to make a phone or a flashlight or a coffee cup. So we don't see the whole phone. We actually are very quickly scanning our brains, finding the pieces, and then putting it together, and then seeing that it is, then recognizing what it is. Okay, so that's another example of a bottom-up theory. So the last bottom-up theory is something called prototype matching. And this theory proposes that we don't have specific templates. We probably don't have like thousands of geometric shapes that we build in order to see, recognize an entire object. We have an idea of what a certain letter is. So an A, we know what an A looks like, but we also, based on that typical A, we can also take a variety, deviations of what that A could be, and maybe in the context of reading something, or in the context of a situation, we can sort of make meaning out of the whatever object it is. So in this case, if you know all of these are A's, okay, if we're looking at like a template theory, we'd say, I don't think this is an A or this is an A, but instead with prototype matching, we can we can tell these are all A's in some way. They really don't look like them and isolated, but when they're input into a context, they certainly could pass for A's. Okay, so we're kind of bringing in the context there with our bottom-up processing and the prototype matching. So then the next part of the lecture that we're actually going to talk, like I said, talk about more during in class, is about the top-down process, which really accounts for context and how we use context to recognize the items around us.